The radio crackled with desperation at 3:47 hours, somewhere in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. Falcon Base, this is Reaper 6. We are taking heavy fire. Repeat, heavy fire from elevated positions. We need immediate CAS, over. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, leader of a six-man SEAL team that had been hunting high-value targets for 72 hours without sleep. What happened next would become legend in military aviation circles, though it would take years for the full story to emerge. The official after-action report would be heavily redacted. The unofficial version, whispered in pilot-ready rooms and special operations bars, would grow with each telling until it became something approaching mythology. But the truth was simpler and more extraordinary than any legend. At Bagram Air Base, the Tactical Operations Center erupted in controlled chaos. 3 Apache gunships were grounded with mechanical issues. The AC-130 Spectre was 30 minutes out, dealing with another firefight in Helmand Province. The nearest F-16s were refueling over the Arabian Sea. On paper, Reaper 6 was alone. That's when Chief Warrant Officer Kazandre "Ghost" Nakamura stepped forward. At 5'4", with 17 years of military service and more combat hours than most pilots would see in 2 careers, she was often overlooked in briefing rooms. Her call sign came from an unusual talent, the ability to appear and disappear from hostile airspace as if she'd never been there at all. "Sir, I can be wheels up in 4 minutes, Ghost said, her voice cutting through the radio chatter and tactical discussions. Major Patterson, the operations officer, barely glanced up from his screens. "Negative, Ghost. You're flying a medevac bird, not a gunship. We need close air support, not a taxi service." Ghost's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sir, with respect, that medevac bird has door guns and a crew chief who can shoot, and I know every ridgeline in that AO." The tactical display showed Reaper 6's position. A narrow valley surrounded by Taliban fighters who held the high ground. It was a killing field. Every second of delay meant more rounds downrange towards 6 of America's finest warriors. Patterson was already reaching for the radio to coordinate with Kandahar when Ghost made the decision for him. She was walking toward the flight line before he could object, her helmet bag slung over her shoulder, calling her crew chief on the internal frequency. What none of them knew yet was that this wouldn't be a rescue mission. It would be something much more dangerous and much more important. In the next 6 hours, Chief Warrant Officer Ghost Nakamura would redefine what it meant to fly into the impossible, and a skeptical military establishment would learn why underestimating someone was often the last mistake you'd ever make. The Black Hawk's rotors were already spinning when the first radio call came in that would change everything they thought they knew about the situation in those mountains. Ghost's A-60 Black Hawk lifted off from Bagram's main runway with the practiced efficiency of a crew that had done this dance hundreds of times. Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos, her crew chief, performed his final systems check while Specialist Amy Chen monitored communications from the left gunner position. They'd flown together for 8 months, long enough to communicate with glances and hand signals when words weren't enough. The aircraft itself was a paradox, officially designated as a medical evacuation helicopter, but configured more like a special operations variant. The medical equipment had been stripped out 2 missions ago to make room for additional ammunition and fuel. Door-mounted M240H machine guns occupied both sides, and Santos had rigged a 3rd gun position at the rear cargo door. It wasn't regulation, but regulations didn't always survive contact with Afghan mountains and Taliban fighters. "Ghost, be advised," Patterson's voice crackled through her headset as they cleared Bagram's airspace. "We're getting intermittent comms with Reaper 6. Signals weak and breaking up. Last solid fix puts them grid 40, 1 RQQ, 12,345, 67,890. Ghost acknowledged while pulling up the digital map on her multifunction display. The coordinates placed the SEAL team in a valley she knew well, too well. 3 months ago, she'd extracted a wounded Ranger patrol from the same general area. The Taliban had learned from that engagement, improving their positions and fields of fire. "Santos, how's our fuel state?" she called over the internal comm system. 4 hours flight time plus reserves, came the reply. Santos was studying the terrain through his night vision goggles, already calculating angles and approaches. "But Chief, that valley's gonna be hot, real hot." "Copy that. Chen, I need you monitoring 3 frequencies, Reaper 6 Tactical, Bagram TOC, and the Emergency Guard frequency. Something feels off about this." Chen adjusted her radio settings and confirmed. At 19, she was the youngest member of the crew, but her technical skills were exceptional. She'd been recruited from a signals intelligence unit specifically because she could pull voices out of static that other operators couldn't even detect. 23 minutes into the flight, Chen straightened in her seat. "Chief, I'm picking up chatter on the Taliban tactical frequency. It's encrypted, but the volume suggests significant activity in the target area." Ghost felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came before complex operations. Her experience told her this wasn't a simple extraction. The timing felt wrong, the tactical situation too convenient. SEALs didn't get pinned down easily, and when they did, it usually meant someone had been waiting for them. She keyed her radio to contact Bagram. "Falcon Base, Ghost 7. Can you confirm Reaper 6's last known mission parameters?" The pause before Patterson responded was too long. "Ghost 7, maintain current heading and speed. Focus on extraction protocol." It wasn't what he said, it was what he didn't say. Ghost had learned to read between transmissions during her tour in Iraq and Afghanistan. Patterson knew something he wasn't sharing, and that meant her crew was flying into a situation that was more complicated than a simple rescue mission. The mountains loomed ahead, jagged silhouettes against the star-filled Afghan sky. Somewhere in those peaks, 6 SEALs were fighting for their lives, and somewhere else, unseen players were moving pieces on a tactical chessboard that Ghost was only beginning to understand. The first indication that nothing was as it seemed came at 4:21 hours, when Chen intercepted a transmission that made her blood run cold. "Chief, I'm picking up American voices on the Taliban frequency. Not SEALs, different encryption pattern. Sounds like someone's coordinating with the shooters." Ghost's hands tightened on the controls. In 17 years of military service, she'd seen enough gray operations to know when something was crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. But she'd also learned that soldiers in contact didn't have the luxury of political considerations. "Can you isolate the transmission?" she asked, banking the Black Hawk to approach the valley from the north, using a ridgeline to mask their approach. "Working on it," Chen replied, her fingers dancing across her radio controls. "Signal's heavily encrypted, but I'm getting fragments. Someone's tracking our approach." Santos had been scanning the horizon through his thermal sights when he spotted the first muzzle flashes in the distance. "Chief, I've got strobing lights bearing 270, approximately 8 clicks out. Multiple positions, elevated terrain." Ghost switched to infrared overlay on her heads-up display. The valley spread out below them like a tactical nightmare, steep walls, limited approach routes, and at least 12 distinct firing positions surrounding a small cluster of heat signatures at the valley floor. Those signatures would be Reaper 6, and they weren't moving. "Ghost 7, this is Reaper 6 actual." Morrison's voice suddenly broke through the static, clearer than it had been all night. "We are taking effective fire from multiple positions. We have 2 urgent surgical, 1 routine. Can you facilitate immediate extraction?" Something in Morrison's voice was wrong. Ghost had worked with enough special operations personnel to recognize the cadence of someone speaking under duress. The transmission was too formal, too precise. SEALs under fire didn't use phrases like facilitate immediate extraction. She keyed her microphone carefully. Reaper 6, Ghost 7 inbound your position. Can you mark your location with IR strobe? Negative on the strobe, Ghost 7. We're maintaining light discipline. Another red flag. SEALs who needed extraction would use every tool available to guide their rescue aircraft. Light discipline was secondary to survival when you had wounded teammates. Ghost made a decision that would violate several protocols but might save lives, including her own crews. She switched to a discrete frequency that wasn't monitored by higher headquarters. Santos Chen, we're going to make one low pass before we commit to landing. I want eyes on everything: personnel, weapons, positions. Something's not right about this. The Black Hawk dropped to 300 feet above ground level, using the terrain to mask their approach. Ghost's night vision revealed details that the infrared couldn't. Fresh fighting positions that hadn't been there 3 months ago, coordinated fields of fire that suggested professional military planning, and something else that made her stomach drop. The heat signatures at the valley floor weren't taking cover. They were standing in the open, weapons at the ready, waiting. Ghost's tactical computer displayed what every pilot dreaded: a perfect ambush setup. The valley floor offered only one suitable landing zone, a narrow strip of relatively flat ground surrounded by elevated positions. Anyone attempting to land would be exposed to coordinated fire from multiple directions with no avenue for escape. Chen, patch me through to Bagram on the encrypted channel, Ghost commanded, pulling the Black Hawk into a tight orbit above the adjacent ridgeline. I need to speak with someone above Patterson's pay grade. While Chen worked her communications magic, Santos continued his methodical scan of the tactical situation below. His years as an infantry soldier before transitioning to flight operations had trained him to read terrain like a book. Chief, I count 14 distinct muzzle flash positions. That's not Taliban, that's professional military establishment. Overlapping fields of fire, coordinated timing on their volleys. Someone trained these shooters. Ghost felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The mission briefing had been unusually sparse. The SEAL team's original objectives had been classified above her clearance level, and now she was staring at what appeared to be a sophisticated trap designed to bring down American aircraft. Ghost 7, this is Falcon Base Actual, came a new voice through Chen's encrypted channel. Colonel Sarah Hendricks, the base commander herself. State your tactical assessment. Ma'am, I've got what appears to be a coordinated ambush in the target valley. Personnel on the ground are not displaying standard SEAL tactical behavior. Recommend abort until we can verify friendly positions and intentions. The pause was longer than it should have been for a simple tactical decision. When Hendricks responded, her voice carried the weight of classified information and political considerations that Ghost couldn't see. Ghost 7, you are ordered to proceed with extraction. Reaper 6 has critical intelligence that cannot be compromised. It was the kind of order that ended careers or created legends, depending on how it played out. Ghost understood the subtext. There were players in this game that went beyond her clearance level, and the rules of engagement were more complex than a simple rescue mission. Santos Chen, we're going in, but we're going in smart. Santos, I want suppressing fire on positions 1, 3, and 7 the moment we cross the ridgeline. Chen, maintain overwatch on all frequencies. If this goes sideways, I want 30 seconds warning. The Black Hawk rose above the ridgeline like a predator revealing itself to prey. Ghost's hands moved with practiced precision, adjusting collective and cyclic to begin their descent into the valley. The aircraft's engines changed pitch as she reduced power, trading altitude for tactical advantage. Below them, muzzle flashes erupted from the elevated positions. Tracer rounds streaked through the darkness, creating deadly geometric patterns in the night sky. But something was wrong with the fire. It was precisely aimed to miss, creating the appearance of combat without the lethality. "Chief," Santos called over the intercom, "they're shooting to miss. This is for show." Ghost's blood ran cold as she realized the implications. This wasn't an ambush designed to kill Americans. It was theater designed to provide cover for something else entirely. And she had just flown her crew into the middle of it. The Black Hawk descended through carefully choreographed gunfire, each tracer round passing close enough to be convincing but distant enough to be survivable. Ghost's 17 years of combat experience screamed warnings, but her orders were clear, and 6 American lives hung in the balance, assuming Reaper 6 was still American. At 200 feet above the valley floor, Chen's voice cut through the engine noise with deadly precision. "Chief, I've isolated that American transmission from earlier, playing it back now." The voice that came through Chen's filtered audio was chillingly familiar, Lieutenant Commander Morrison, but speaking to someone else entirely. "Package is secure. Initiate extraction protocol when the cavalry arrives. Maintain the fiction until we're airborne." Santos had heard it too, and his machine gun swiveled from the external threats to cover the landing zone below. "Chief, those aren't SEALs down there. At least not our SEALs." Ghost faced a decision that would define her career and possibly her life. She could follow orders, land in the valley, and hope that whatever operation was unfolding would sort itself out at a higher pay grade. Or she could trust the instincts that had kept her alive through 2 combat tours and 17 years of military service. She chose a third option that violated every protocol, but honored every principle she'd sworn to uphold. "Falcon Base, Ghost 7. I have mechanical issues with my hydraulic system, aborting landing and returning to base for emergency maintenance." It was a lie that could be disproven by post-flight inspection, but it bought her crew time and distance from whatever was happening in that valley. The Black Hawk climbed rapidly, using the terrain to break line of sight with the firing positions below. "Ghost 7, negative on your abort," came Patterson's immediate response. "You will complete the extraction mission." "Sir, I have a hydraulic caution light and intermittent control response. I will not risk my crew and aircraft without proper maintenance evaluation." Ghost switched to the discrete frequency and tried to reach Colonel Hendricks directly, but found only static. Someone had jammed the encrypted communications, leaving her crew isolated with incomplete information and contradictory orders. Chen's voice was tight with concentration as she continued monitoring multiple frequencies. "Chief, I'm picking up movement on the valley floor. The heat signatures are boarding vehicles. They're leaving the area." Santos confirmed through his thermal scope. 6 personnel in what looks like modified Humvees, heading east toward the Pakistani border. No indication of wounded personnel. The tactical picture was becoming clearer, and it painted a scenario that Ghost wished she couldn't see. Someone had used her crew as unwitting participants in an extraction operation that had nothing to do with rescuing SEALs and everything to do with moving assets across international borders under cover of a fabricated firefight. As the Black Hawk climbed towards safer altitude, Ghost made another decision that would either vindicate her instincts or end her military career. She was going to find out exactly who Reaper 6 really was, and why someone had been willing to risk American lives to extract them from Afghanistan. The flight back to Bagram gave Ghost time to piece together fragments of a larger operation that made her question everything she thought she knew about the war in Afghanistan. Chen continued monitoring communications, capturing encrypted transmissions that painted a picture of coordination between American and unknown elements that extended far beyond a simple rescue mission. "Chief, I'm getting chatter suggesting this was a scheduled extraction, not an emergency rescue," Chen reported. "Someone's been planning this for weeks." Santos had been unusually quiet during the return flight, studying thermal imagery he'd captured of the valley. His infantry background gave him perspectives that most aviators lacked, and what he was seeing didn't match any legitimate military operation he'd encountered. "Those fighting positions down there were professionally constructed," he finally said. "Took weeks to prepare, maybe months, and the personnel we were supposed to extract had equipment that's not standard issue for any SEAL team I've worked with." Ghost filed Santos's observations while running through her own tactical analysis. The mission briefing had contained subtle inconsistencies that became glaring in retrospect. The timeline hadn't made sense. SEALs didn't get trapped without extraction options unless someone wanted them to be trapped, and the communications protocols had been modified just enough to prevent standard verification procedures. As Bagram Air Base appeared on the horizon, Ghost made a decision that would either clear her conscience or end her career. She switched to the emergency frequency and transmitted in the clear, knowing that multiple agencies monitored that channel. Any station, this is Ghost 7. I have information regarding irregular operations in Grid 41 RQQ 12,345, 67,890. Request immediate debrief with intelligence personnel. The response came from an unexpected source, not Bagram's operations center, but a different voice entirely. Ghost 7, this is Raven 1. Maintain radio silence and proceed to Hangar 7 upon landing. You are expected. Hangar 7 was reserved for aircraft involved in classified operations. Ghost had never been directed there, despite her years of flying special operations support missions. Someone with significant authority was taking an interest in her crew's activities, and that could mean either protection or elimination of witnesses. Santos Chen, when we land, stay with the aircraft. Don't discuss tonight's mission with anyone until I get back from debrief. And if something happens to me, Chen has copies of all the communications intercepts on her personal storage device. Chen nodded grimly. At 19, she was learning that military service sometimes required choosing between following orders and following conscience. Tonight had been an education in the gray areas that existed between official policy and actual operations. The Black Hawk touched down on Bagram's main runway at 5:47 hours, just as the sun was beginning to rise over the Afghan mountains. Ghost shut down the engines and watched through her windscreen as 3 black SUVs approached the aircraft. She didn't recognize the personnel who emerged, but their bearing and equipment suggested they weren't regular military. As she walked toward Hangar 7, Ghost reflected on the decision she'd made in that valley. She'd chosen to trust her instincts over her orders, and now she was about to learn whether that choice would make her a hero or a traitor. Hangar 7 smelled of coffee, cigarettes, and secrets. Ghost had been in enough classified briefings to recognize the atmosphere of an operation that existed in the shadows between official policy and deniable action. 3 men in civilian clothes sat at a metal table, their faces bearing the weathered look of professionals who'd spent careers managing situations that never appeared in official reports. The man in the center introduced himself simply as Smith, a name so generic it was obviously false. His accent suggested East Coast education and decades of government service. The other 2 remained silent, their attention focused on tablet computers that presumably contained Ghost service record and the night's activities. "Chief Warrant Officer Nakamura," Smith began, "you've had an interesting evening. We'd like to discuss your tactical assessment of the operation in the Coast Province." Ghost had prepared for this conversation during the flight back, knowing that her answers would determine not just her career, but potentially her safety. "Sir, I observed what appeared to be a fabricated combat scenario designed to provide cover for an extraction operation of unknown personnel." Smith's expression didn't change, but one of his companions looked up from his tablet with something approaching interest. Ghost interpreted this as encouragement to continue. The tactical situation was inconsistent with legitimate SEAL operations. The personnel on the ground displayed training and equipment that suggested professional military background, but their behavior under supposed enemy fire was inconsistent with standard special operations protocols. "And what did you conclude from these observations?" Smith asked. This was the moment that would define everything that followed. Ghost could provide the safe answer, express confusion, and defer to higher authority. Or she could state what she'd actually observed, knowing that truth had a way of being dangerous to people who preferred shadows. "I concluded that someone was using legitimate military assets to extract personnel whose presence in Afghanistan couldn't be officially acknowledged. The entire firefight was theater designed to provide plausible cover for an extraction that had been planned well in advance." Smith leaned back in his chair, and for the first time his professional mask slipped slightly. "Chief Nakamura, you have 17 years of exemplary military service. Your record shows exceptional judgment under pressure and absolute loyalty to your fellow service members. Those qualities are rare and valuable." Ghost recognized the tone. She was being recruited, not interrogated. Someone had been watching her career, evaluating her reliability and discretion. Tonight's mission hadn't been a rescue operation. It had been a test. "Sir, I need to know that my crew isn't in danger because of the choices I made tonight." "Your crew performed exactly as trained. Sergeant Santos and Specialist Chen showed excellent tactical awareness and appropriate discretion. Their careers will be unaffected by tonight's activities." Smith opened a folder and placed a single document on the table. It was a transfer order to a unit that Ghost had never heard of, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment's Classified Detachment. "Chief Nakamura, there are operations that can't be officially acknowledged but are essential to national security. Personnel involved in such operations require exceptional judgment, tactical skill, and absolute discretion. Your actions tonight demonstrated all three qualities." Ghost understood what was being offered: promotion into the world of deniable operations, where the rules were different and the stakes were higher. It meant leaving behind the relatively straightforward world of military medicine and rescue operations for something much more complex and morally ambiguous. The decision Smith was asking Ghost to make would reshape not just her career, but her understanding of the war she'd been fighting for the past 3 years. The classified world he represented operated with different rules, different objectives, and different definitions of success and failure. "Sir, I need to understand what happened tonight before I can make any commitments about future operations," Ghost said, choosing her words carefully. "My crew deserves to know they weren't used as unwitting accomplices in something they can't morally support." Smith exchanged glances with his companions before responding. "The operation tonight involved the extraction of assets who had been operating in Pakistan under unofficial cover. Their intelligence value was significant, but their presence couldn't be officially acknowledged due to diplomatic sensitivities." It was a sanitized explanation that raised more questions than it answered. Ghost had seen enough classified operations to recognize when she was getting the public relations version of events rather than operational truth. "And the fabricated firefight," she pressed, "provided necessary cover for extraction while maintaining plausible deniability for all parties involved. The Taliban fighters were aware of the arrangement. They were compensated for their participation." Ghost felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd spent 3 combat tours fighting Taliban forces, losing friends and colleagues to their improvised explosive devices and sniper attacks. The idea that some of those same fighters were participants in American operations crossed lines that she wasn't sure she could accept. "Sir, with respect, my crew and I took risks tonight based on the belief that we were rescuing American service members under enemy fire. If that wasn't the case, Then we were deceived about the nature of our mission." Smith's expression hardened slightly. "Chief Nakamura, the global war on terror requires operational flexibility. Sometimes that means working with elements that in other contexts might be considered hostile. The strategic objectives justify tactical compromises." Ghost had heard similar justifications throughout her military career, usually from officers who made decisions from air-conditioned offices rather than cockpits under fire. The difference tonight was that she'd been forced to make tactical decisions based on incomplete and deliberately misleading information. "I understand strategic necessity, sir, but I won't knowingly participate in operations where my crew is exposed to unnecessary risk based on false information." One of Smith's companions leaned forward and spoke for the first time. "Chief, what would you say if I told you that tonight's operation prevented a terrorist attack that would have killed hundreds of American civilians?" It was the classic moral dilemma: accept operational deception in service of a greater good, or maintain personal integrity at the potential cost of lives. Ghost had seen enough of war to know that such choices were rarely as clear as they appeared in briefing rooms. "Sir, I'd say that I need to see evidence supporting that claim before I risk my crew's lives on it." Smith closed the folder containing the transfer orders and stood up. "Chief Nakamura, you have 72 hours to consider this opportunity. Your current assignment will continue unchanged during that period, but understand that some doors, once closed, don't reopen." Ghost returned to her crew at the flight line to find Santos and Chen performing post-flight maintenance with unusual intensity. Both had been in the military long enough to recognize when their aircraft had been involved in something more complex than routine operations, and they were processing the night's events in their own ways. "Chief, how did the debrief go?" Santos asked while checking hydraulic fluid levels with unnecessary thoroughness. "Complicated," Ghost replied. "We're going to continue normal operations for the next few days while some people make decisions above our pay grade." Chen looked up from her communications equipment with the expression of someone who'd been listening to frequencies she probably shouldn't have monitored. "Chief, I intercepted some interesting traffic while you were in the hangar. Multiple agencies are very interested in tonight's mission, and not all of them seem to be on the same side." Ghost felt the familiar weight of decisions that extended beyond her immediate crew. In 17 years of military service, she'd learned that the most dangerous moments often came not during combat operations, but during the quiet intervals when various bureaucracies sorted out the political implications of tactical decisions. "What kind of traffic?" she asked. CIA communications suggesting tonight was part of a larger operation that's been running for months. Defense Intelligence Agency transmissions indicating they weren't fully briefed on tonight's activities, and someone from the Inspector General's office requesting complete records of our mission. Santos stopped his maintenance work and looked directly at Ghost. "Chief, in my experience, when multiple agencies start fighting over an operation, the people who actually executed it usually end up as casualties. We need to be careful about who we trust and what we say." Ghost appreciated Santos's infantry background more than ever. Soldiers who'd served in multiple combat zones developed instincts about bureaucratic warfare that could be as important as tactical skills. Tonight had potentially made her crew players in a political battle that extended far beyond Afghanistan. "For the next 72 hours, we maintain normal operations and standard communications protocols," Ghost decided. "Chen, I want you to maintain copies of all the intercepts from tonight, but don't access them except in an emergency. Santos, our aircraft maintenance records need to be absolutely perfect. Someone's going to be looking for discrepancies." As the sun rose over Bagram Air Base, Ghost reflected on the choices that had brought her crew to this moment. She joined the military to serve her country and protect American lives. Tonight had forced her to confront the possibility that those objectives might sometimes conflict with the orders she received from her superiors. The next 72 hours would determine whether her instincts about the nature of service and sacrifice aligned with the realities of modern warfare. Ghost had always believed that doing the right thing and following orders should be the same thing. Now she was learning that the world was more complex than her ideals had assumed. She made a mental note to research the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment's classified detachment, knowing that the decision Smith was asking her to make would shape not just her career, but her understanding of who she was as a soldier and as an American. The next 48 hours passed with deceptive normalcy. Ghost's crew flew routine medical evacuation missions, transported supplies to forward operating bases, and maintained their aircraft according to standard protocols. But beneath the surface of military routine, Ghost was conducting her own intelligence operation. She used her administrative access to research personnel records, cross-referenced mission reports with classified databases, and gradually assembled a picture of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment that differed significantly from its official description. The unit existed primarily on paper, with personnel drawn from multiple services and agencies for operations that required absolute deniability. Chen proved invaluable in this research, using her signals intelligence background to access databases and communications archives that revealed the scope of unconventional operations being conducted throughout Afghanistan and Pakistan. What they discovered was a parallel military structure that operated alongside conventional forces, but answered to different authorities and followed different rules. Chief, some of these operations have been running for years, Chen reported during a private conversation in Ghost's quarters. Personnel rotation suggests they're managing long-term assets throughout the region, not just conducting tactical missions. Santos had been conducting his own research through informal networks of special operations personnel. His contacts in various units provided perspectives that weren't available through official channels. The word is that the 160th Classified Detachment handles operations that can't be acknowledged even within the special operations community, Santos reported. Personnel who join don't maintain contact with their original units, and their families are told they're assigned to training commands or administrative positions. Ghost was beginning to understand the full implications of Smith's offer. Joining the classified detachment would mean disappearing from her current life and identity, becoming part of an organization that existed in the shadows between official policy and operational necessity. It would mean abandoning her crew and accepting moral compromises that she wasn't sure she could live with. On the morning of the third day, Ghost received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Hendricks appeared at the flight line without advance notice, wearing the expression of someone who'd spent the previous 72 hours managing political fallout from operational decisions. "Chief Nakamura, walk with me," Hendricks said, leading Ghost away from the aircraft and crew members. "We need to discuss your future in my command." They walked in silence to a section of the base perimeter where conversations couldn't be overheard or recorded. Hendricks had been a pilot herself before transitioning to command positions, and Ghost could see in her bearing the weight of decisions that required choosing between competing loyalties. "Chief, I've been briefed on the offer you received from the Interagency Task Force," Hendricks began. "I want you to understand that accepting that assignment would mean leaving not just my command, but the official military structure entirely." Ghost had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by her commanding officer made the decision more real and more consequential. "Ma'am, can you tell me anything about the legitimacy of the operations they're conducting?" Hendricks was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her words against classification restrictions and political considerations. "Chief, there are aspects of this war that don't fit neatly into conventional military doctrine. Sometimes that requires operational flexibility that exists in gray areas between official policy and tactical necessity. It was a diplomat's answer that confirmed Ghost's suspicions, without providing the moral clarity she needed to make her decision. Colonel Hendricks continued their private conversation with the careful precision of someone navigating classified information and personal conscience. "Chief, your actions 2 nights ago demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and integrity that made you attractive to the interagency task force. But those same qualities are why I need you to remain in my command." Ghost appreciated the colonel's directness, but she needed more information before she could make a decision that would define the rest of her military career. "Ma'am, I need to understand whether the operations they're conducting serve legitimate national security objectives or whether they're serving other interests." "That's exactly the right question," Hendricks replied. "And the honest answer is that sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between the two. The global war on terror has created operational requirements that don't always align with traditional military ethics." They walked along the perimeter fence in silence, both lost in thoughts about the nature of service and sacrifice in an era of unconventional warfare. Ghost could see in Hendricks's bearing the weight of command decisions that required choosing between competing definitions of duty and honor. "Ma'am, if I decline their offer, what happens to my crew?" Chen intercepted communications suggesting multiple agencies are interested in our activities from that night. "Your crew will be protected," Hendricks assured her. "Sergeant Santos will be promoted and transferred to a training command where his infantry experience can be used to prepare other aviators for combat operations. Specialist Chen will be assigned to a signals intelligence unit where her technical skills can be properly utilized." It was a solution that protected her crew while separating them permanently. Ghost understood the subtext. Accepting or declining Smith's offer would result in the dissolution of her current team regardless. The question was whether she would disappear into classified operations or continue serving in conventional military roles. "And if I accept their offer," Ghost asked, "then you become someone else entirely. New identity, new background, new loyalties. The person who flew that mission 2 nights ago ceases to exist in any official capacity." Ghost had always believed that military service required personal sacrifice, but she'd assumed that sacrifice involved risking her life rather than abandoning her identity. The choice Smith was offering represented a different kind of service, one that required moral compromises she wasn't sure she could accept. "Ma'am, I need to know that whatever decision I make serves the interests of the American people, rather than the convenience of bureaucrats who make policy from secure offices." Hendricks stopped walking and turned to face Ghost directly. "Chief, that's a question that every military professional has to answer for themselves. The system isn't perfect, and sometimes serving your country requires accepting imperfect choices." As they walked back toward the flight line, Ghost realized that her decision would be based not on perfect information or moral certainty, but on her personal understanding of duty and honor. In 17 years of military service, she'd learned that the most important choices were often made with incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. She had 24 hours to decide who she wanted to be for the rest of her life. Ghost spent her final evening of decision in the base chapel, not from religious conviction, but because it was the only place on Bagram where she could think without interruption. The chaplain, Major Rodriguez, had seen enough combat veterans wrestling with moral complexities to recognize when someone needed space rather than conversation. The events of the past 72 hours had crystallized into a single question. What did she owe to her country, her crew, and herself? Military service had always meant accepting orders from superiors who presumably had access to better information and broader perspective. But the mission 2 nights ago had demonstrated the limitations of that assumption. Chen appeared in the chapel doorway, respecting the sacred space, but clearly needing to share information that couldn't wait for a more convenient time. Ghost gestured her inside, appreciating that her youngest crew member had developed the tactical instincts necessary for survival in an environment where information could be as dangerous as enemy fire. "Chief, I intercepted something you need to know," Chen whispered. "The assets we extracted 2 nights ago weren't American intelligence operatives. They were contractors working for a private military company that's been conducting unauthorized operations in Pakistan." The revelation hit Ghost like a physical blow. She'd been offered recruitment into an organization that used official military resources to support